They said, so even if the winter gets cold, it should cost you a lot less this year to heat your homes. And really, it has not cost you this much since 2004 to heat your homes. So that's not a bad thing. I don't want to turn the heat on either. But it's an interesting thing when we turn the heat on that we go over to this unit on our wall. Now, how many of you have the old dial units still? You know, you spin the dial to a temperature that's vaguely similar to where you want the temperature to be, and you just kind of hope that works. Nobody? You don't like waking up into the Arctic freeze and then having to get up and turn the heat on? How many of you have like the computer programmed ones that like your coffee pot, the heat comes on about a half hour before you do, so that when you get up it's at least reasonably warm? Yeah, so a lot of us do. Thermostats are an interesting thing because thermostats dictate what the temperature is going to be within the context of your house. We have a pair of thermostats here. I know when we got here, I think Brother Doug used to come in like an hour, 2 hours before church and turn the heat on, didn't you? He used to come in, and then I think he went and get coffee, and he came because he gets up in the middle of the night anyway every day of the week, and so he's used to being up at like ungodly hours, and so he got, I think, voluntold to come in since he was up anyway and turn the heat on and then go treat himself to a cup of coffee or something that he could pay for. That's just always been the way. But we replaced them a couple years ago with the computer programmed. And so just another case of, machines taking over a human's job, and now Doug has to sleep in and have coffee with his wife, and I'm sure it's tragedy. But that's thermostats for you, right? They control the temperature, dictate the temperature of your house. Now, how do you tell the temperature in your house? You use another device, right? BC, I see your hand up. What is it? The computer. We're close, but no cigar. You can't smoke at church anyway. No, it's not the thermostat. It's the thermometer, right? The thermometer is what we would typically call that. How many of you actually say that thermometer? A couple of you do, just to be weird. Why not? You can put the emphasis on whatever syllable you want to. You have the thermometer, and the thermometer measures the temperature in your house, but the thermometer can't do anything about it, right? I mean, your thermostat has a thermometer, but it's the thermostat that dictates the temperature. The thermometer only measures the temperature. I mean, it could be 35 degrees below zero in your house, unhealthy, unsafe, and your pipes are shot, but the thermometer can't do anything about it. It just measures it. It just tells you what you already knew, and that's that it's cold, right? And so there's a big difference between a thermostat and a thermometer or thermometer. We get that difference, right? I don't have to spend any more time on this. You understand the difference between those two things. You say, why in the world? Because in the book of Ruth, where we're heading today, Ruth chapter 1, in case I forgot to tell you, in the book of Ruth, we're actually going to see this very significant interplay between a thermometer and a thermostat. It's not there. The words thermometer and thermostat are nowhere in the book of Ruth. But we'll see this interplay between these two things in what is, I think, a very life-applicable kind of a way. Ruth chapter 1. Now, as we begin, we talked last week in the first 5 verses of Ruth, and the point last week was simply trusting God is difficult, but trusting self is dangerous. And that was kind of like the whole package from last week. Trusting God is difficult. I wouldn't try to lie to you on that one. Trusting God is tough. It is hard. It's difficult. And anybody who tells you differently has never had to trust him before. Trusting God is difficult, but trusting self, which is our greater temptation, is dangerous. And what we're going to see as we go into this week, as we go into verse 6, and we're actually going to get through the rest of chapter 1, is how that danger of trusting self kind of plays out and emerges in our life. So Ruth chapter 1, I want to pick up in verse 6, and we see in verse 6, first of all, Naomi's determination. That Naomi has made a decision, she's made a determination. We're going to see it in these first couple verses. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Now let me just interrupt and stop right there to say, what? Surely there are not still people alive in Bethlehem, are there? You kind of see that there's the implied thing there. I mean, it doesn't state that there are people alive there, but if God has brought bread back to the house of bread, there are probably people there who are actually harvesting grain, and there are people who are actually still living there to eat this bread, right? This is all kind of implied in the text. Would that be shocking to Elimelech, do you think? Because Elimelech had decided that there was no food in Bethlehem and that there was no way to sustain life in the middle of this famine. And so Elimelech decided that he and his family were going to move to Moab because to stay in Bethlehem was a death sentence. That's what drove him, was I can't provide for my family here. We're all going to starve to death, and so we're going to move someplace where I can provide for my family and we won't starve to death. Did everybody in Bethlehem starve to death? Did anybody in Bethlehem starve to death? Probably no. And so this is the shock of, here's a guy who decided to trust himself and not God, and lo and behold, God had it covered. Now, did everybody get thinner in Bethlehem? Probably. That's what happens when there isn't as much food. Obesity is harder to pull off. But they didn't die of starvation. God actually provided for them. And so here's Naomi. She's sitting over in Moab, and she's a widow, and she's got 2 daughters-in-law who don't even speak her language as a first language, and they're all sitting there in the Moab, and they're looking at each other, and she hears word that there is bread in Bethlehem, that the bread basket is full, that God has taken away the famine, and God has brought back the bounty that is normal for her hometown. And she makes the determination that she is going to go home again. Verse 7, therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, they get about, they're traveling there to Bethlehem, they're heading toward the outskirts of Moab, and she turns to her daughters-in-law and says, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And so they're having this big boo-hoo fest right there on the side of the road from Moab to Israel. So Naomi's determination, she was determined to return home. But she was determined to return home alone. She wanted Orpah, and she wanted Ruth to actually go back to their parents' houses and not to make the same mistake that she made. And that mistake was to leave home. You ever left home at about 9 o'clock in the morning, you're like, that was a mistake, I should have stayed home today. About 2 to 3 times this week on 495 as you sat in traffic while somebody else's car burned. Yeah. But even worse than that, there are times that we leave home and we realize that going away from everything that we have and everything that we know and everything really that identifies who we are is a mistake. And so she's like, I want you to return home. I don't want you to make the same mistake that I made. I want you to return to your mother's house, and I want you to find new husbands, and I want you to stay here and raise families in your homeland. Stay here. She was determined that she was going to return home, but she was determined to do it by herself, alone. Her daughters-in-law had a different idea. Her daughters-in-law were determined that they were going to stay together. That was their determination in this thing. They're like, okay, well, we're with you. We're going where you go. And we see this play out, beginning in verse 10. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. No, we like you. We're going to go with you to your homeland. But Naomi said to them, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go, For I am too old to have a husband. If I should have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lift up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And so the two girls, their determination was that they were going to stay with Naomi. They were going to go with her. But Naomi was really determined that she was going to go alone. And she kind of tries to parry their enthusiasm with this argument that it's for them had to have been a weird custom. For us, it's an absolutely archaic one. But she reaches into a Jewish custom and says, look, am I going to have more sons? Would you honestly wait for them? Because in the custom of Israel, one of the customs they had was if a man married and then died before he had a son, the expectation was that his younger brother would take his wife for his wife and that he would actually raise up a son in the name of his father. And so, in a kind of scenario, oldest brother gets married, he dies, next brother comes up, marries her. His first son actually bears the name of his uncle, bears that name, and he's raised as an heir, as a son to the older brother. The second son and following then would bear the name and carry the inheritance of the younger brother, who's actually their father. And so this is the custom that is kind of on display. And we're going to see throughout the book of Ruth several times where these odd customs come up. This is not as odd. There's one that's actually weirder. But in our way of thinking, this is very strange. If I died without having children, which clearly didn't happen, but there would be no expectation on my part, nor my wife's part, nor your part, nor any sane thinking person's part, that my younger brother would marry my wife and that his first son would be my son. And my wife's going, no, ew, right? It's so very foreign to us, isn't it? But that's what she's saying to Orpah and to Ruth. She's like, I have no other sons. Even if I had a husband tonight and had children right away, would you wait 15, 20 years and then marry my son who would now be 20, 30 years younger than you? Are you really? She's like, this is not even realistic. This isn't even feasible. So if you come with me, you're going to be a widow for the rest of your life. There is no realistic expectation that I can do anything about it. And she says, so you need to go home and you need to go find somebody who's actually a full-grown adult now and get married. Because let's face it, they had only been with Naomi. Naomi's whole sojourn in Moab had only been 10 years. We don't know how old either of these two women were. We don't know how long they had been widowed, but it wasn't that long. They were certainly still young enough to remarry, to have children, to have a home, to have a family, have all of those things. And Naomi says, look, why don't you go back and do all of that? So she had no more sons to offer them. She had no hope of a husband who would provide for them. They were always going to live in this widowed status where they're scraping by for an existence. She had no expectation that was going to change. And she had no solace in a God who cared. And this is the harder part there at the end of verse 13. It grieves me for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She had absolutely no solace in the Lord. She said, God stands against me, and all these problems I have, God did this. Now let's stop and think for a second. Did God do this? Why is it when we make bad decisions and we enter the consequence phase of those decisions, do we suddenly blame the consequence on God when it was we who made the decision? People that are like that? I saw on Facebook, and I wish I'd gone digging to find it, this picture. It was actually a church sign. I thought about putting it out here, but I decided that it wouldn't go over real well in New England. The sign said, bad things happen for a reason. Sometimes the reason is because you're stupid and make bad decisions. And thinking, one, that's too many words, and two, I'm not sure that our community around us would get that. But sometimes that's the truth. Sometimes the consequences we have are because we're stupid and we make bad decisions, and the consequences of those decisions aren't God's fault. But here's Naomi, she's looking at her whole life, and things aren't turning out well. She's in the consequence phase, and she says, God is against me. And it grieves me to have to tell you this, that God hates me. This is all God's fault. And God is sitting there in heaven going, what? Me? I didn't have anything to do with this. I didn't tell you to leave. Right? But that's kind of our nature, isn't it? And so she throws all of these arguments at her daughters-in-law. And we find right there at the end in verse 14 that Orpah kind of relents. That Orpah, she kisses her mother-in-law goodbye, and she's like, all right, I'm going home. And so she heads back. But Ruth is still determined to go with her. And so Naomi tries again one more time in verse 15. She tries again to convince Ruth to go. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. And so what's weird in verse 14 gets incredibly sad to the point of destructive in verse 15. Orpah has decided to return to her people. Orpah has decided to return to her gods. And Naomi's saying to Ruth, you should do that too. Now, is that ever good advice? The Moabites worshipped many false gods, but the primary god that the Moabites worshiped was a god named Chemosh. Now, Chemosh was often portrayed as a fish god, which is not terribly important, but he was the god whose name meant destroyer or subduer. So why don't you go back home and worship that destructive, subduing god of yours, Chemosh? Now, make a mental note here, Chemosh, destroyer, subduer. We're going to run into these ideas again, so just make kind of a mental note here. But Chemosh worship generally involved immorality because most man-made religions get there at some point, and the Moabites were no exception. I mean, they were a people who owed their entire heritage to an immoral relationship. And so, this was just part of their worship. And on special occasions, Chemosh worship actually requires human sacrifice. Awesome. Ruth, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and she's returned to her gods. You should return to your people and you should return to your gods. Could you give any worse advice than to return to your gods? There is no time when someone who follows God should ever recommend that a person follow or resume following their native gods instead of God. There is never a time where somebody who worships and follows and serves the true God should ever recommend that a person worships or resumes worship of their native God, whatever their native God might be. Now, that's not politically correct, but it is eternally correct. Because the one common element that all false gods have is they send you to the same place, and it's not heaven. And so it's never a good. You say, well, won't that destroy their culture? I don't think it necessarily destroys culture to say, worship God. Now, might it change culture a little bit? Yeah, if the Moabites had started following God, guess what? Immorality would have been out the window, and so would human sacrifice have been. Where's the disconnect here? Why is that a bad thing? You think about the Indians in South America, the Native Americans, whatever you want to call them, the Aztecs, the Incas, all that. Why did they disappear? Because they were killing each other. And they were draining their blood out into their own water supply, and then they were drinking that, and they were dying. They were brilliant people. had they actually had somebody who was there, a real representative of Jesus, who could have taught them about having a relationship with Jesus and ending human sacrifice and thereby drinking clean water. Would their culture have changed? Yes, it would have changed a little bit. Would that have been a bad thing? No. Would they still be alive? Quite possibly. So is it going to change somebody's culture if you say, oh, they need to know about God? It might. But they'll be around to thank you for it or complain about it, as the case may be. And when they get to heaven, they'll definitely thank you for it. Again, it's not politically correct because we want everybody. There are still people groups on our planet today who are still walking around worshiping trees. And I don't mean like postmodern people. I mean like people running around in loincloths in underdeveloped places who are still worshiping their ancestral gods and still doing the same things. Do they need Jesus? Yes. Would that mess up their culture? Probably. But is that a bad thing? No. But that's not politically correct, is it? And so sometimes we just have to bite the bullet and say, you know what, we're not that popular, but I want to see people in heaven, not hell. And if that means their culture changes a little bit, fine. Is it going to change completely? No. If so, every European country on the planet would have the same culture. Do we? No. You go to England, try to talk to people there, you won't even understand what comes out of their mouth. Forget what goes into it. Their cultures are different. Missionaries going from America to England still suffer culture shock. It's still different. You go to Australia, good grief in the morning. Forget about it. So is it going to change culture? Possibly. Is it going to undo it completely? No, because who you worship as a God isn't the only factor that bears on culture. There are a lot of other things. Tradition, language, music. Those things you can leave alone. They're fine. Anyway, I'll stop ranting. So Naomi says to Ruth, you should follow her. But Ruth is resolute. Ruth makes a very bold declaration that she is going, and that's all there is to it. And she makes this great statement in verses 16, 17, and 18, which has been argued as being this great and poetic and forceful literary statement. And she says this, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. How's that for resolute? And what do you even say to that? There is no answer to that. She says, I'm going where you're going. I'm adopting your people as my people. I'm adopting your God as my God. I'm adopting your culture as my culture. I'm adopting your ways as my ways. I'm adopting your language as my language. I'm going with you, and I'm going to place myself under a curse if I don't. So stop talking about it. And we find then, verse 18, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now, the implication isn't there the rest of the trip was silent and she stopped talking altogether. The implication there is that this matter of Ruth returning home was closed. They could talk about anything else, but that one was done. Conversation was put to bed. The decision was made. We're moving on. And so they continued then to Bethlehem. They get to Bethlehem, and they get this interesting reception. Now think about it for a second. Here you are. Kids in the room, you probably don't get this particular piece of this. But adults in the room, if you've moved away from home, you do. You know what it's like to go home again? You've been away for a while, and you go home. Even if it was just, you went to college, came back after a couple years, and it was just like everything at once was familiar and yet not. They built up new streets. There's a new gas station over here. This thing is something else, and that thing is something else. And you know how that gets. That kind of nostalgia, but familiar, but not familiar. You got a lot of weird stuff going on in your head when you go home. And so, Naomi's going, and now Ruth, this is all brand new, and you can almost picture her as they're walking along, and this was that, and so-and-so lives there, and this is over here, and this is where this happened, and this is where that happened, and processing this whole thing as they're, rolling up into town, and they get this very interesting response from the people in town. Oh, Smurf, which I failed to copy in. Maybe I have a Bible? No, seriously, I forgot it. Hold on, I got mine right here. Joshua, hey man, it's right there. Right behind you. Love technology, but every once in a while it backfires. All right, so beginning of verse 19. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" So they're getting into Bethlehem. Now Bethlehem sits just a couple miles south and a little bit west of Jerusalem. It's kind of a small village, was never anything very big. I mean, the only person that you know of that came from Bethlehem was David and then Jesus, but neither of them have been born yet. We're several generations before there. And Jerusalem at this point in history isn't even Jewish. Jerusalem still belongs to the Jebusites. It's a city called Jebus. And so, they're like right on the edge of hostile territory. And so this has never been a big town, but all of a sudden Naomi and this very exotic, strange woman with her come walking into town. And there was just this sense of excitement because they didn't get visitors very often. And the people are, you get that poking your head out through the door and poking their head out through the window. And some people start to recognize Naomi, but they're not real sure. Is this really Naomi? Is this really? And I think what it tells us is that the years had not necessarily been kind to Naomi. That she left this, alive, vivacious, pleasant woman. But let's face it, she's buried a husband. She's buried two sons. She's tried to provide for two daughters-in-law as she's lived in a foreign land. And she now believes that the hand of God rests squarely on her shoulders because God doesn't like her. All of these things will wear you down. And so they're like, is that really her? Is that Naomi? And you can almost hear the whispering going, is that Naomi? I think it is, but it looks kind of like her, but it looks not kind of like her. You ever had that weird sensation that you see somebody and you think you know who they are, but you're not 100% sure because some time has gone on and you're like, that looks like that person, but I don't know. And what's the worst thing? You can walk up to and say, hey, how are you? And act like they're them and find out they're not. And so this is what's all going on. But she said to them in verse 20, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Naomi's response to the people that are excited about meeting her again is, first of all, don't call me Naomi. Now, if you remember from last week, Naomi, her name means pleasant one. And that may have been her disposition as well. But she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Now, Mara is a word that means bitter. I am bitter. She said, God's hand is against me, and I am bitter. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Wow, she had to be really a killjoy, huh? Yeah, I'm home. Call me bitter. I'm a bitter old woman. And that was by her own admission. I'm a bitter old woman, call me bitter. God hates me. He's taken away everything that made life full for me. He's testified against me, literally subdued me, and he's afflicted me. He literally destroyed me. Oh, wait, what? God testified against me. He has subdued me. God hates me, and he has destroyed me. Remember I told you to mark those two words, destroy and subdue? What God were those in reference to? God? for some false god in Moab named Chemosh. Seems like Naomi's concept of God got a little askew, doesn't it? Like it shifted. Like she was viewing God as though he were Chemosh. He has subdued, he has destroyed. That's what God does. No, that's not what God does. That's what Chemosh does. It's important to note that. And we get the editorial thing at the end of verse 22. They came at the barley harvest, and that'll play more into next week. But she blames God for her emptiness, even though her emptiness is a consequence of her family's choice to leave, to provide for themselves instead of trusting God to provide. And she blames God for her bitterness, even though her bitterness is a consequence of misrepresentation of who God is. Her bitterness is directly because she is misrepresenting to herself, granted, but still misrepresenting who God is. Is God destruction? Is God subdue? No. That's not who God is. And so she begins to misrepresent who God is, and that has made her bitter. So on the one hand, the story has improved a little bit from last week. Last week we started in famine and people fleeing for their lives and scarcity, and that was bad. Except that God actually provided for his people, so it wasn't so bad. But on the other hand, you could argue that this section, the story actually kind of worsens a little bit as it really pinpoints in on Naomi. Because I don't know about you, but when she tells her daughter-in-laws, return to your people and return to your gods, I think that's bad advice. I think that's bad for her, and I think, oh my goodness, things are getting bad, but that's not even the worst of it. She gets there and she's like, just call me bitter because God is to blame for my circumstances. I'm bitter. But when she stopped trusting God and started blaming him and who he is, really fundamentally changed her understanding about who he was. And the God that she's talking about isn't the God of Israel, isn't the God that we know. The God that she's talking about is a God that she has created. It's a twisting of who God is. It is a misunderstanding, but it is a God now that she has created herself. This is not God as he revealed himself, and that is significant. Because bitterness and her other attitude problems are the thermometer that let her know there's a problem. What's the thermostat? Her understanding of who God is. The fact that she's bitter is just a measure of the temperature. It's just a measure that there is a problem. But the problem, what's actually setting the tone, what's actually setting the attitude, what's actually setting the direction for her is who God is. And because the thermostat's set wrong, the thermometer is picking it up, and she's bitter. And it's a subtle difference. Because she would argue, no, I'm talking about God. And we would say, no, you're talking about Chemosh, maybe, but God, no, because this is not God. And we would argue that it's a subtle difference. Is it subtle? Yes. Is its impact subtle? No. How subtle is it? Let me ask you this. How many bitter Christians have you ever met? Yeah? You've met bitter Christians? Maybe you've been a bitter Christian. I won't pick on you. I have. But how many bitter Christians have you ever met? Now, I've grown up in church. I've been in church since I was 7 years old. I won't tell you how old I am now, but that's a lot of years. I just don't want to think about it. And over those decades, I have seen a lot of very bitter Christians. Guess what they've done? They've misrepresented who God is, if only to themselves. That's been the driver. The bitterness is just a thermometer. Now, lest we be too quick to dismiss this, let me just also say that because you could look at yourself and say, I'm not bitter. Usually if you're having to make that statement, you probably are. It's like when you say, hey, no insult intended. Liar, whatever you're about to say is insulting and you mean it. But lest we be too quick to dismiss it and say, oh, I'm not bitter, let me just tell you this. Bitterness comes in several sizes. Like good coffee, you can pick a size. Small size of bitterness usually manifests itself as disappointment. We tend to become disappointed with the resources that we have or the life that God has provided. Say, I'm not bitter, I'm just disappointed. Yeah, you're bitter. It's the small size. The medium-sized bitterness manifests itself as despair. We tend to become very desperate over our lot in life, and we see God maybe even as the source of our problems. That's usually where we get closer to thinking, clinically bitter. That's just the medium size. It actually gets worse. Large-sized bitterness manifests itself as disavowalment. We tend to decide that we're not going to follow God anymore. We'll just go it alone. You know some people who decided this whole God thing didn't work for me, and so I'm out. People who used to go to church who don't go to church anymore. People who used to read their Bible who don't read their Bible anymore. People who used to have a faith and talk about it who seem to be like non-existent faith anymore. You know anybody like that? We all know people like that. That's bitterness. That's just the big size. Unfortunately, it comes in extra large too. Extra large manifests itself as disdain, where we tend to hate God so much that we ridicule him and anyone who would dare to still follow him. You know what's really sad? Is that I can put faces to each of those sizes in my mind. That I have met and I know people who I'm convinced actually are Christians who have bitterness in each of those sizes. Say, a Christian can't hate God. Oh, yeah, we can. I've seen people who do. Christian can't ridicule other. Yeah, they can. I've seen them. So let's not be too quick to dismiss bitterness, because when we really begin to pick away at it and we really begin to push at it, what we will find is that bitterness actually is very common experience for Christians. And I would argue that 99.999% of the people in this room either have or will experience bitterness in one form or another. I'm not sure about Bella. She's the odd out. She's a happy little kid sleeping. I'm kidding. She'll get there too. She's cute, but she's a sinner. So what do we do? Because here's what I don't want to happen in my life, and I don't want to happen in your life. I don't want bitterness to really take hold. And I don't want that thermostat that's driving the bitterness to actually get stuck at the point where you're bitter and you're okay with it. Again, the bitterness is just the thermometer. It's not the driver. It's not the thermostat. The thermostat is your perception of who God is, or your representation to yourself about who God is. And so no matter which size bitterness you happen to experience, no matter which size bitterness you happen to have on display at the moment, it all comes back to a root cause of you are misrepresenting who God is, even if only to yourself. That's what's driving the bitterness. So what do? Quickly, and we'll close. A couple things. First of all, recognize it. The biggest problem that we have with most of the sins in our life is we don't want to see it for what it is. Recognize that your bitterness, whether it's disappointment or disdain or anywhere in between, recognize it for the bitterness that it is. Recognize it for the sin that it is, because you're missing the mark of what God wants from you and for you. Misrepresenting God, even to yourself, is a sin. Which brings me to the second point. Confess it. Recognize it. Confess it. That's what you do with your sins, right? You confess. You say, God, you're right, I'm wrong. This is a sin. That's the Christian life. Third thing you need to do, adjust it. You know what it's like in our house if the house gets really cold? You know what I do? I walk over to the thermostat and I do this. And I turn the temperature up as much as my wife will let me. And if it gets really hot, we turn it down as much as my kids will let me. I'm really not the deciding factor anywhere here. I'm kidding. Adjust it. If you observe it in your own self, observe it, confess it, adjust it. How do you do that? Learn how God represents himself. That means you're going to need some time in this thing where God revealed who he is. We call it a Bible. I actually have one now. And you're going to need some time in relationship with God. We might call that prayer. And then lastly, monitor it. Keep watching the thermometer of your attitude so you don't have another problem. You know, some of you may remember a few years ago I had a Buick Rendezvous. I kind of liked the truck, and until the second engine went, I really liked it. But at the point where you blow the second engine, it's probably worth getting rid of. But after I blew the first engine, one of the things that I found myself always doing in that truck was I watched the temperature gauge. Because that's where the problem I had was master cylinder cracked and you have water flowing wherever, and all of a sudden the temperature started going up where it shouldn't. And that was my indicator that there was a problem. That's how I knew when I blew the second one. Same place I blew the first one, oddly enough. But I watched the temperature gauge all the time because I knew if that temperature started to climb, that I had a problem. Now, I've got the car here. I got the Pontiac I've been driving now for a few years. You know what? I still look at that temperature gauge every day as I'm driving. It became an instinct for me because I don't want to blow a third engine in a second car. It's expensive. And so I keep watching the temperature gauge on my car because I know if it starts to climb, I need to pull over and I have a problem. And I'm just instinctively now, I watch the temperature gauge on my car. We need to do the same thing in our lives. Once we observe that we have a problem in our attitude, that means we have a problem in our perception of who God is. We need to observe it. We need to confess it. We need to adjust it. But we got to keep monitoring it. Because if you became disappointed in who God is once, if you became disillusioned in who God is once, if you got to the place where you even disdained God once, guess what? You have a propensity for it. You have a weakness in that department. It could happen again. You want to keep your eyes on the temperature gauge of your attitude. And as soon as you see your attitude slipping, observe it, confess it again, adjust it again, keep monitoring again. The reality is we're all going to be there at some point in our lives. I wish I could say you're going to skip it. If you've never experienced this, the one promise I can have for you, you will. Because we're all flawed, fallen human beings. It doesn't mean we're bad. It does mean we're sinful. What I can say is if you haven't experienced it yet, keep your eye on the temperature gauge because you will. And if you're there today, admit you're there. Confess it. You're not going to surprise God. He knows. And adjust it. Spend some time with getting to know, again, who he has revealed himself to be. Because that's who you need to worship. Not the image of God that you create yourself. That can get weird in a hurry. Father, we love you. I thank you for this word. Lord, it's interesting to see this in Naomi. And easy to miss in ourselves, and yet, Father, if we would be honest, we would say that we see this in our own lives. That we all see times where who you are gets a little bit out of whack in our own heads. And it takes a lot of weird twists and turns. But it always impacts our attitude. And that becomes the thermometer that there's a problem. And so, Father, would you help us today to be honest about what the thermometer says in our own lives. Father, would you help us to be willing to confess it? Would you help us, even more importantly, to get back to experiencing you as you are, not as we think you are. You as you've revealed yourself to be, not you as we have imagined you to be. And then, Lord, would you help us to be vigilant in watching the temperature gauge of our own attitudes, because we don't want to go back there. You're amazing. And you should always be amazing and awe-inspiring to us. And anytime you become less than that, we have a problem, not you. And God, that's just not a problem we want. Would you help us, we pray, to keep our eyes on you as you are. Trusting you, not trusting ourselves. Worshiping you, not worshiping what is ultimately ourselves. Well, thank you in Jesus'